In given the outcome from Rome, the Catholic Church once again making history in electing their first American Pope. 69-year-old Cardinal Prevost was elected yesterday. He's now the 267th occupant of the Papacy and the new leader for about 1.4 billion Catholics around the world. Prevost, who will now take up the name of Pope Leo, spent many years in Peru. That's where he served as a missionary and later as a bishop. President Cyril Ramaphosa has described his election as a profound moment for the church and the global community. Let's continue unpacking this with what's becoming a very familiar voice, by the way, the administrator at the Cathedral of Christ the King, I beg your pardon. That's Father Lawrence Ndlovu, joining us now via our video link. Father Ndlovu, great to have you on the program again. Thanks as always for making time to speak to us. You've had some time now to take this in, and I watched as you tried to make sense of it in real time. So in the lead up to this particular election, we were told that, the cardinals will meet, they'll decide on what the church needs. And now we've got the benefit of hindsight. We've got an Augustinian who was a cardinal for less than 2 years and comes from a non-majority Catholic country. That's the United States. Help us connect the dots. What message do you reckon the College of Cardinals are sending?
Well, thank you very much for having us once more. What is interesting about this particular appointment is that the Church Fathers have not just appointed somebody who has a history of being a very great administrator or a technocrat, somebody who certainly, as you've rightly said, born in Chicago in the United States, but spent the bulk of his time as an ordinary priest working in Peru in Latin America for about 30 years plus. Then, of course, as you've said, he's Augustinian, so he's also religious, and the Augustinians following the spirituality of St. Augustine, which is the core foundational theological thought in terms of Christian spirituality. Augustine himself having been an African theologian, just as a side trivia there. And so to have somebody who's been a priest, who's been a bishop working in the favelas of Latin America, in that diocese that he referred to, that he loved so dearly, then becoming cardinal, a cardinal who became the head of the Congregation for Bishops, assisting the late Pope Francis to select bishops across the world, and also president of the Commission for Latin America. So what we see is quite a well-rounder, a scholar, having a doctorate in canon law as well. He speaks more than 4 to 5 languages, as we've heard him speak on the balcony. So I think they've gone for a stable personality, but also a bridge maker, one that a lot of nations will find that they can relate to.
When I was speaking to our correspondent in Rome, we touched around just how much has been made of his nationality, and he has pointed out in a very eloquent way that there's always been this kind of idea, even amongst the cardinals, that you don't want a pope coming from one of the world's superpowers, and that, of course, that trend has been bucked with the election of this particular pope coming from the US. What kind of, reflections do you have insofar as that is concerned? The church seen consolidating, perhaps inadvertently, America's power in the world by having this individual who has links to that country.
You could view it the other way around as well. It could be that they are diluting it, by having yet another American who is in a position of power, although we know that completely different from what would seem to be the trend currently. One who has spoken in his first address to the world about issues of social justice and building bridges, which is a completely different conversation, I suppose, from what is coming out of the United States currently. He's also, a Peruvian citizen, and I know that Americans and his family is still in America, but having worked in Peru for the bulk of his ministry and his life, he also took up Peruvian citizenship. So it's very interesting in that, as much as he's definitely owned as he should be owned and be proud to be American, but also it gives the making of the man, as it were, in his ministry and his life in the church, also coming out of the Americas, but in this case, Latin America. So yes, we never thought that we would get an American Pope because of that worry, I suppose, of this sort of consolidation of power, too much concentration of power, and wouldn't want to be viewed in that particular way. But the very fact that he is not one of the cardinals who is currently leading a leading diocese in America, resident in America, and has spent the bulk of his ministry in America, also helps to sort of make him a bit more palatable. We've read his tweets and things like that, so we know that he's quite stern, as it were, on on the area of social justice. And so it's going to be interesting to watch that dynamic between what is the Trump administration and himself. But also, he's not just called, although he's American, he's the Pope for the world, for every nation, for every people. I learned last night, for example, that when he was leader of the Augustinian order, he had visited South Africa about 20 years ago, and he was in Durban to see the work that is done by the Augustinian sisters. He was in Kenya just recently as well to consecrate a church there at the invitation of the Augustinian order. So we do know that he's a man at the service of the world, not just the interests of the Americas.
Fair enough. In fact, I've seen some people mentioning in a tongue-in-cheek way that Donald Trump is no longer the most influential American in the world. So perhaps to your point, that power may have been diluted in one way or the other. But in more serious matters, Father Lawrence, we always wait to hear the name that the Pope will take on, because I think there too lies a few signals. But it's also interesting, I suppose, to kind of think of his theological influence. As we've mentioned, he's an Augustinian. The order of priesthood started by St. Augustine of Hippo, who was a very strong theological voice, even for priests like yourself who train in the seminary. But his literature, St. Augustine of Hippo, has also had influence outside the church. I mean, books like Confessions, I think it's The City of God is the other one, are often quoted by individuals who, I suppose, think about these things deeply, both in and outside the church.
Yes, and you look at the theology of of Saint Augustine. He learns a lot from the sort of Platonic philosophy, the duality of the city, of the world of forms and the world of man. And he writes quite elaborately about the city of God and the city of man. Saint Augustine of Hippo had been a man in the world, and his conversion is quite phenomenal when you read in his Confessions. And those grand statements, a beautiful statement that he writes, our hearts are restless until they rest in you, signaling a man who's gone through a journey of finding the Lord. And I think that very human aspect of St. Augustine is what comes out even from when he was Cardinal Prevost was Cardinal. You could see the desire for the human journey to find fulfillment in the Lord. And he spoke about that quite beautifully. I do think that he has this tremendous task now, the new Pope Leo, to traverse what his mentor and the person he followed and admired, the theologian St. Augustine, to hold the line between the city of God and the city of man. And may the city of God be the one that wins ultimately. You speak so correctly about the choice of name, Pope Leo. And we were led to think about his namesake, Pope Leo XIII, who was a social justice pope. Pope Leo XIII wrote one of the most powerful documents, which I would recommend, during the era where the industrialization was seeming to be rising in the world. And he wrote Rerum Novarum. In there, he speaks about the dignity of every human person, and that human beings are not just tools for labor, but they must be, and their rights must be preserved and respected. He speaks very early on about there must be the formation of trade unions, hint, hint, hint. And later on, of course, you will see what would emerge to be what the trade unions are right now in the world. So there are subtle influences there that you see clearly, that the links between what was Pope Francis's interest in social justice and the advancement of human dignity and people in the world is still going to be very much center stage in this particular pontificate. And we're looking forward to see how that manifests itself.
Yeah, absolutely. To use a cliche, in many ways, the real work starts now. And we spent some time over the past couple of days, Father, reflecting on what I think is quite a spectacular choreographed series of events that have unfolded. I mean, if you went into a coma 2 weeks ago, you wouldn't know that the Pope died, he was buried, and his successor has been elected. It's a moment that has great global resonance, but I'm sure has also had a lot of impact on individuals. I mean, we saw people crying, for example, at St. Peter's Basilica yesterday. What has this moment meant for Lawrence Ndlovu, who in many ways is also connected to what the world has witnessed?
Well, I'll start with the most selfish part of me. As you know, the Cardinal Archbishop of Johannesburg was also in the conclave, right. Cardinal Stephen Brislin, whom I work with very closely here. And the entire time I kept on thinking, he better come back, he better come back, he better come back. So I'm delighted that that hurdle has been particularly dealt with. It was also quite moving for me this morning as we celebrate Mass every morning here at the Cathedral of Christ the King. And at every Mass, the Pope is prayed for. And to be able for the first time to say Pope Leo XIV in the celebration of the Masses this morning. And in all the churches across the world, for as long as he shall be Pope, he shall be prayed for. But it also means this entire period from the death of Pope Francis to right now, we're reminded of the apostolic traditions and the apostolic foundations of the church and the global mission that we have, the shared humanity that we have. It was so fascinating for me to see the interest coming out of the people we serve here in South Africa, equally to the people in America, equally to the people in Europe, in Asia, and so on. And for a moment there, we were all Catholic. And for a moment there, we really could not have been bothered about our differences and our different, preferences in terms of what we would like to see and all of that. And I was also particularly moved by the fact that the first words that this new Pope, Pope Leo, spoke about were the words that Jesus Christ himself said after the resurrection, the first words of Jesus Christ, which tells you the centrality of what he's interested in. Peace be with you. And that, for me, is the best way to begin.
Yeah, and we know how desperately needed peace is needed in the world right now. Father Lawrence Ndlovu, always a pleasure. Thanks very much indeed for sharing your reflections with us. Father Ndlovu is the administrator at the Cathedral of Christ the King in Johannesburg.